This is Gareth Southgate, and this is the Three Lions podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Three Lions podcast. My name is Russell Osborne and this is an independent England football supporters podcast. Regular listeners of the show, well, you may remember a couple of previous episodes where I focused in on former England managers, namely Sir Walter Winterbottom and Sir Alf Ramsey. And I spoke with biographers for each of those, Walter Winterbottom's son-in-law, Graham Morse, and Dave Bowler for Ramsey's. And the aim is to try and go through each manager chronologically. Now, I'm sure many of you will know that after Ramsey came Joe Mercer, but that was only in caretaker capacity. And I think we're going to look at caretakers another time. But basically, after Alf Ramsey came Don Revie in 1974, an interesting character to say the least. And I'm pleased to say I've joined by Christopher Evans, who has recently written the book Don Revie, the Biography. It is released through Bloomsbury Sports Books. Christopher, hello there.
How are you? Okay?
I'm very well, thank you. Yourself?
Good. Yeah, very good, very good.
Now, one thing I ought to say is, through doing this podcast, I've always said, never mix football and politics. And I've broken that rule now. Just introduce yourself and explain how that fits in.
I'm Chris Evans, and since 2010, I've been the Member of Parliament for Islwyn in South Wales, and I'm also the Shadow Defence Procurement Minister. So that's my political bit then. So we'll go into the sport now then. Okay, and I promise I won't give any politician-type answers. Well, I'll try not to, but try and break the habit of a lifetime.
The book is Don Revie, the Biography. I'm going to point this out now. You're Welsh. How has this all come about?
To be honest, where it comes from really is where I grew up in South Wales, which is miles away from any of the big cities. You know, I grew up in a place called the Rhondda Valleys. The only teams on television were Manchester United and Liverpool during the 1980s. And I mean, to the point where we were in street gangs where you were either Liverpool or you were Man United, and we would try and, one gang would try and convert another one into Liverpool or Man United. And to be honest with you, they were on television all the time, and I found it, same. I wanted something a bit different. And I always remember following the 87 FA Cup. And if I remember, I think Manchester United went to Man City very early on in the fourth round or something. And suddenly it wasn't going to be a Man United-Liverpool final. They weren't even near the finals. I think it was Tottenham reached the final that year against Coventry. And I think one semi-final was Tottenham versus Watford. But the other one was Leeds United versus Coventry City. And I always remember on ITV there was a montage of showing the great days of Leeds. So the first time I'd ever heard T-Rex, which is, I'm a secret fan of Mark Bolan and T-Rex and that glam rock era. It was the first time ever you'd Get It On. And I always remember that beat, Get It On, bang and gong. And there was this team in pristine white. And I love the old, fell in love with the old football shirts at that point, all in white, no sponsor's name, just the old LUFC down the side. And there they were playing Manchester United with the fabled, Charlton, Best and Low in the side. And they were goading them to try and take the ball off them because they were so good. And then you had Billy Bremner lifting the 1972 FA Cup. And then this man, Don Revie, they said, the Don Revie lifting the 1974 League Championship. And then Billy Bremner was the manager of Leeds at that time. And he always been the boss. He'd always been the godfather. He was the dominant person in my life. And I was just really fascinated by how this guy had become so dominant, these players. 5 years later, then, Leeds beat Manchester United for the title under Howard Wilkinson. And I remember every newspaper starting with Dirty Leeds, disgraced Don Revie. And then, this wasn't coming from, anybody serious, shall we say, who talked about football, the Garth Crooks or the Gary Linekers. This was coming from Jimmy Greaves. This was coming from Emlyn Hughes. People I thought was comedians. I didn't really, I started watching football in the 80s. I didn't remember these players. All I remember them was being quite funny. St. Greaves on a Saturday lunchtime. Emlyn Hughes on Question of Sport. Very funny. You always laugh at. Particularly Emlyn Hughes, how much he hated Don. He was money ruled. He's obsessed by money. Don Reddies. He was up to all sorts. And I couldn't understand why these comedic figures suddenly turned on this man. To the point, I knew nothing about Revie at that point. I was 15, 16. I just loved football. But genuinely thought he committed a crime. I thought he'd done something so serious. He was the name you dare not mention. And what was funny recently, during lockdown, ITV started showing big games again. The 87 Cup final was interesting.
Yeah.
79 was in there. But the 1989 title decider was in there. And Don Revie died that night. And usually it says, oh, it's a sad day for football. We've lost so-and-so. There was no mention of Don Revie through that game. And I was very interested how in 1974, my research, what I would say in 1974, had he died in 1974, left for Arab Emirates in 1974, people would have said, Don's a pioneer. He's the forefront of football. He's now selling football to Dubai, But by 1977, he is an absolute pariah. To the point, the FA are going after him in a witch hunt. The Daily Mirror are making just digging out anybody, Gary Spray, Bob Stoker, just to say something about this guy fixing matches or throwing matches or whatever you want to say. You even had an incident which is in the book where it said Don Revie appears in the crowd for Leeds versus Middlesbrough. Of course he's going to be there. He managed Leeds and he's from Middlesbrough. Of course he's going to watch the two matches. On the Monday morning, the FA sent a letter to the 92 clubs. Do not think of employing Don Revie because he has been banned from any football activity in this country for 10 years. So they not only just banned him as well for just leaving a job he didn't like, they also restrained the trade as well. They restrained him from doing the job that he was most qualified to do. So what I got very interested in is how he became a mystery man, how he arrived at that stage. And I think history, I think his contemporaries were unfair to him, and I think usually history sorts matters out. I think they always say history treats you better than your contemporaries, but unfortunately history doesn't treat him that way as well. A lot of his allegations are completely unfounded, without fact, and he's still reported as fact. And that's really where the fascination for Don Revie come from, in a long-winded way.
Well, I mean, from my own personal opinion or perspective, when someone says the name Don Revie to me, immediately I think of, as you say, dirty Leeds. And then it's the England job. And then there was this Dubai, UAE sort of era that I didn't really know a great deal about, to be honest. And the book goes through it all. It's a great book. And I've rattled through it. It's really easy to read. But I think let's start at sort of the beginning, because he was a player as well. But I think even from his sort of personality that people saw later on probably came from his sort of tough childhood, and he lost his mother early, and the environment he grew up in.
I think losing his mother was had the biggest effect on his life. He lost his mother at 11, and I think I say in the book as well, there's an example there of him going to school early because his father had to go to work, his twin sisters had to go to work. He would just kick the ball with tears rolling down his eyes because he missed her so much. And I think this gave him a sense of insecurity. And I think before his mother died as well, I mean, his father was at work for 2 years, and they would earn, he was trying to feed a family of 5 on 24 pence. There's instances of his mother having to take washing in from the posher parts of Middlesbrough as well, where he actually had to help out and do the laundry for these more affluent families. He says, they walked to Middlesbrough town centre at the end of the day on a Saturday to get the scrag ends of the meat, to put the soup, so they had some meat that week. There's instances of his father having to just find sticks to put on the fire. It just feels that there was a lot of hardship there. Add into that as well, I always say this, if you look where the old Ayson Park is, it backs onto the Hollowgate Wall, as they call it. And beyond that wall was the workhouse, which there are some instances in the book of some horrendous things happening there, which would really cast a shadow over where Revie was from in Bell Street as well. That then became the sort of the labour exchange where people had to go there to see if they could qualify for benefits. His father had to go through that, and it was quite humiliating as well. And then his mother died there. So I always say Ayson Park was his place for his dreams, but also beyond it was his nightmares. And I think this is where the insecurity came from. I mean, there's instances of him becoming very superstitious at this point in his life. He drops to his knees every night and he prays to God as well. He also say in the book as well, he has this belief that there's always a pitfall around the corner. And I think that goes into his career as well. He goes into the one, football at that point is really insecure. He has to work as an apprentice builder just in case he doesn't make it. He's working all day and then training at night as well. He breaks into the Leicester team at 21, smashes his leg in 3 places. They say to him there's 1,001 chance he will returning from this, Don. And his manager, Jockey Duncan, says to him, you're going to be that 1 in 1,000 man, Don. And he was. But then he reaches the cup final. It looks like, he's turned it around. A couple of weeks before, he gets into a challenge with a West Ham defender, takes an elbow on the nose, breaks his nose, and keeps hemorrhages. It keeps him at the 1949 FA Cup final.
He was on his deathbed, wasn't he?
Yeah, he nearly died. Yeah, they put him in a taxi, and he went to Plymouth, and they played Plymouth Argyle, and he was put in a taxi, and he nearly died because he bled so much all the way back to the Leicester infirmary. Yeah, Elsie actually said his wife said half an hour later, and he'd have been dead. So how serious that was, and I think he always had this feeling about him that something was going to go wrong. But then he felt, and I think it's where the superstition comes from, he felt, one thing he can't control is that chance that we all live by. Something will go wrong anytime. We all know that, right? Yeah. But he's trying to eliminate that by being superstitious. Johnny Giles got a great story. He told me he just went into the boss's room and they had a new pair of boots and he put them on the desk. And Revie said, "No, you've done it now." He said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, we're going to lose on Saturday because you just put new shoes on the desk." So he believed that. It was bizarre. There's an incident in the 1956 Cup final where he's getting changed. He takes 2 blocks of wood out of his jacket. Ken Barnes says to him, "What are those, Don?" He said, "A gypsy has said I carry these around and I achieve all my dreams." It's all these little things that ornamental elephants he had a problem with, like those hated birds. He thought he lost the 65 Cup final because there was an owl on the Leeds shirt and a liver bird in a Liverpool shirt. You know what I mean? So, that was all bad luck for him as well. And there's a lovely picture in the book as well, which we see Shankly and Revie walk over the 1965 Cup final. And Shankly's swaggering like a gangster, that was a proper. He loved all those movie gangsters, James Cagney and George Raft and all those. And he always thought he was like one of them. And Revie's there, got a fixed smile on his face. His pockets are full of rabbit's foots and Lucky Charms and other things. Wearing a blue suit, we all thought was lucky. And walking behind him is Bobby Collins, the captain Leeds, 5'3" of him, wearing yellowing woolen socks. The reason they won every time he wore them, and he insisted they wore them that day as well. So you could see that it's still this idea that he's trying to grab for something that he can't control. You know what I mean? So I think that comes, I think, from a background where life is very uncertain and life is very and also you think his mother was 51 when she died. Life is very short as well and uncertain for him, I think, and those things get embedded into you in your formative years.
Yeah, this explains a lot. But as a player, let's say you mentioned they played for Leicester and played for Manchester City, played for England. He won 6 caps, scored 4 goals, and he scored on his debut, as 1 or 2 England managers have done. And he was also the Football Writers' Player of the Year back in '55. Mm-hmm. But reading the book, it was like he was always reaching for the next best club or trying to find that next best club. And I think sometimes he was a little hard done by.
I think he said, though, Leicester were the only club where he felt he was in a family atmosphere. He was where he was being looked after. He married the manager's niece in Elsie Duncan, was part of the famous Duncan family, 3 brothers who played for Leicester anyway. I think the move from Leicester to Hull, he wanted to play with Raish Carter. He thought he could learn from Raish Carter. I try to get over in the book, I think, in that chapter, Hull chapter, he sits down with Raish Carter. And bear in mind, he was, even at that age, he was mad about tactics. He was under George Sanderson when he was in Middlesbrough, who was a tactician and used a board with corks on to move around the sort of players. He then was at Sep Smith at Leicester. We came very close to him. Again, all he taught was tactics. He sits there with Raish Carter, who at that point was a very, we don't even remember him now. That's the sad thing about most of these players now. But he was seen as up there with Stanley Matthews, as an inside forward. And he was expecting, this download of information was something he revelled in. And he tries speaking to Raish Carter, and Raish Carter gives him 1-word answers and then throws a few football books at him and he goes to bed. And Don's just sitting there going, "I've made a huge mistake." So I think that was the move from Leicester to Hull. Genuinely was he wanted to learn from someone, and he thought going under Raish Carter, he learned there. Disappointment. The move to Man City was a real ambition. He realised to be stuck around with Hull Steves and becoming just another journeyman, and he just went there. And I think the problem was that he could be very thin-skinned. I mean, with Man City, there's the best stuff where he goes on holidays where he says that he signed it off with the manager and they said he didn't. And then he got suspended. He was Footballer of the Year and he wanted out after that. He goes to Sunderland. He ends up having a punch up with the manager and ends up going to Leeds. And again, there's all these instances where he's quick to take offence, I think, sometimes. Perhaps there's maybe a failing in him, I don't know. But I sense that he's always looking for that place where he belongs.
Yeah.
And that doesn't really come to him, I don't think, until 61, 62 when he's the manager of Leeds and he can shape that side around him. He gets in Leeds what he wants. He gets free. Harry Reynolds gives him the money. He's also got a set of young players, the Norman Hunters of this world, Paul Reenies, Madeley, very famously Billy Bremner was there, Gary Sprigg was there. And he can mould those boys, all looking up to him because he's Footballer of the Year. He was captain of the side as well. Now he's manager. And he's the father figure. And he can mould that. He can find that he's got that, can do what he wants for that club. And he gets total control there. And that's why I think Leeds went off and became such a fantastic side, to be honest.
Well, it wasn't immediate, was it? He was there for 13 years, I believe. But when he took over, he began, they were in the old second division.
Yeah. I mean, they were lucky not to go to the third division. I mean, he came down the day of the season in 63. It wasn't really for him, I don't believe, until Bobby Collins came along that he had a prayer. Bobby Collins, 5'3". Derek Temple said to me, described him as one of the most temperamental people he'd ever met. Again, whereas I think Revie would be thin-skinned and leave. Bobby Collins would be looking for a punch-up. There's one incident where he didn't have the hook he wanted in the Everton. He came from Everton, I should say. He came from Goodison Park, but he didn't have the hook he wanted, and he wanted to fight everybody in the dressing room. But what he did, he came there, senior pro again, very famous, former Celtic, former Everton. Players like Billy Bremner wanted to aspire to be like him. He was playing in the centre of midfield. He was they call him the pocket Napoleon. He was the general. He turned all around. Off the back of Bobby Collins being there, there's the disgruntled winger at Manchester United called Johnny Giles. John looks at Leeds when he got a chance to go to Blackburn or go to Leeds. He looks at Leeds, goes, Bobby Collins. He said to me, I said, why do you sign for Leeds? He said, 2 reasons. So 2 words, he said, Bobby Collins. Because if Bobby Collins was there was something about that side. And so through that, he was attracting those players. But until Bobby came along, there was real problems. But also, I think people forget about what he did to Jack Charlton. I mean, he says to Jack Charlton when they're playing together, Jack, if I was ever manager of this club, you'd be the first person out the door. Yeah. But then when he does become manager, he says to Jack Charlton, you screw your nut on, right, and I can make you an England player. And Jack Charlton then, under him, flourished and became an England player. Went from being this ne'er-do-well who was more interested in drinking, gambling and field sports, suddenly became very focused and famously then, went on to become a member of the 1966 World Cup winning side. So people forget that. He was turning players like that round. He was looking at them saying, there's something in this boy, but I've got to bring that out. And I think that was the real magic in what he managed to achieve at Leeds United. And again, when we talk about famous players coming in, Alan Peacock came there, was famously partnered with Clough at Middlesbrough as well, was breaking all records as well. So, I think after Bobby Collins came there, that set everything in stone, and that was the start of Leeds. The downside of that is I think players like Bremner were sort of ingrained by Collins. They needed to look after themselves, and that's where the toughness and the aggression that we knew from Leeds United in the glory years, that's where that come from, that Bobby Collins mentality, I think.
Well, there's 2 things you mentioned there. Brian Clough, and we'll touch on him in a minute, but you said that the glory years, and they really were for Leeds, because pretty much throughout his time, they were always in the hunt for trophies, or, I mean, I don't think it was really classed as like the top 4 back then, but if it was today, they would still be classed as a great team in the top 4. They were FA Cup finalists, FA Cup winners, title winners, European trophy winners, which was what the old Fairs Cup and
twice,
yeah. So Revie always, to me, reading the book, he always wanted though that one step further, the European Cup, and I think that was possibly one thing that maybe he went regretting.
Well, he said, I think there's an interview towards the end of his life that he gave when he was diagnosed with motor neuron disease. He said, I live for the day when we won the league championship. I live for the day when we won the European Cup. I lived for the day then when we could play for the World Club Championship and we could say we were the best side in the world. And it never happened. And of all the things, I think, this was a guy very driven, very ambitious. And one of the saddest things he said, he never got there. And I think at that point, I think what he realised was, I think this is where the turning point in Revie comes, where you see what people remember Revie as, this paranoid, obsessed, desperate to win, this guy that is just so aloof almost, because he's so tunnel vision about winning. I think he wins the title in 1969. He does have a huge ambition. He says himself he wants to be up there. Bear in mind, at that point, you're near Jock Stein and Matt Busby, Sir Matt Busby by then, had won the European Cup. he thought even though he was called one of the greatest managers of all time, it was his record, he felt he would only be seen as one of the greatest if he could get his name with Stein and Busby.
Right.
And of course, the furthest they go was the 1969 semi-final against Celtic, which they lost. But then he realises, and like now, and you've been Champions League all the way through, from the moment they got promoted to the time he left. They never finished below any of the traditional Champions League places. 5 times they were runners-up, twice they were league champions. They would have been playing Champions League all the time. But in those days, he had to win the title to compete in the European Champions Cup. And that, in the end, I think absolutely drove him mad. They lost out in 71 to Arsenal on the final day of the season, and Tottenham and Arsenal drew. Arsenal wouldn't have won the double, and Leeds were champions. In 72, had they not played the FA Cup 3 days beforehand and lost to Wolves, they'd been champions again in 72. And 74, they were champions. So you've got to look. There are 2 occasions, definitely, where they should have been champions. I mean, in 1965, as far back as 65, the first season of the top flight, they only lost out to Manchester United on goal average as it was then. You know what I mean? So they were always very close. But I think once he had that taste of that European Cup, he wanted more. And it drove it. And I said Johnny Gill says it as well. I've quoted in the book. He didn't realise you couldn't win them all. And in the end, it drove him absolutely mad. And I think, this is where the problems then come with Stoke, come with Clough. They're in his way. He wants that European Cup desperately, wants to get his hands on it. And I think Clough has said in that interview, in the calendar interview with Austin Mitchell, he said, it was only a fraction of you not taking that England job. And I just wonder what was going, you never know what people think at the time. I wonder what Revie was thinking in 1975 when Leeds reached the European Cup final against Bayern Munich and were robbed of it. Let's be fair, they were robbed. Yeah. They had 2 goals disallowed, right? It was a travesty, And I wonder what Revie was commentating that much. I wonder what was going through his mind. I wonder if he was thinking, well, I'd rather be down there than at Lancaster Gate, Yeah. But you don't know,
No, absolutely. Yeah. So, as you say, 73, England failed to get to the World Cup in the 1974 World Cup, and obviously Alf Ramsey was in charge then. There was the famous Poland game, and Revie was always been, I think, had been touted a few times before as being the England manager, and then Joe Mercer obviously came in for a little while, but Don said that Alf Ramsey was treated quite harshly in being taken from the England job.
It's interesting, though, as far back when Ramsey first took the job in 62, Revie's name was being touted even then. Alongside people like Jackie Milburn. So he was in the mix for a long time for that job. And I think I mentioned as well in 1970 when Wilf McGuinness was sacked, there was a heavy lots of stories in the press at that point were that Alf Ramsey was going to go to Manchester United and Revie was going to replace him in England. So there was always this idea that anything happened with Ramsey, Revie was going to come in and replace him. And I think there's a myth that's grown up, obviously, about Ramsey that, he had that terrible draw against Poland, but then he led them to a 0-0 draw against Portugal. He even picked the side for the games that Joe Mercer taken over from for. There was no plan within the FA for another man to come in. They just decided, Harold Thompson, as the vice chair of the FA at that point, decided he didn't like Revie and didn't like Ramsey. He wanted to do anything to get rid of him. And again, this insecurity with Revie. Revie always said that, of the outstanding record that Ramsey had, he won the World Cup in 1966. He had some bad luck in 1970, but believed they would have won the World Cup again in 1970. Revie's on record as saying that. He felt there was a lot of bad luck with Bonetti and Banks, and the heat got to them, etc. But he always said they would have won the World Cup in 1970. But he always said that if they could sack him after just one bad game, then they'd have no worries about getting rid of Revie as well. And this was insecurity that stayed with him. And I think the reason he thought Ramsey was treated appallingly in terms of also he was one of the lowest paid managers as well, outside of the top, if in comparison to the top flight. Ramsey wasn't paid very well. He was treated horrendously by Sir Harold Thompson, who was a snob and obviously fell out with Revie as well at another point. But I also think Revie was always conscious that Ramsey didn't have a very good reputation with the press. And very often I think Ramsey came across like he was being persecuted by the press. And that was the first thing that Revie tried to do was, curry favour with the press. Some of the simplers giving sandwiches and tea during press conferences, always been available, speaking of football writers' conferences as he did as well. the talking at Manchester where he invited 54 players and also the press were allowed to come there as well. So he was always very open. So I think Revie felt that Ramsey was treated very, very harshly indeed.
What I found was quite interesting that he didn't actually apply for the job, and the job position was actually advertised in the Times, England manager, which I think is amazing. But obviously he got the job back in '74. England hadn't qualified for the World Cup that year, but obviously '78 was on the horizon. 5-year contract and a salary of £25,000. And I read in the book, it was quoted as him saying, "I'm delighted to be given the chance to manage England. This must be any manager's dream." And as you say, he sort of threw himself into it in the respect that he wanted to be treated well by the press. But one thing I do just want to sort of touch on, the salary there, £25,000, as I say, was far more than Alf Ramsey was being paid. Throughout the book, he was always looking to secure his family's future, is what's often said, from a financial position. Was it be fair to say he was money driven?
I think you've got to look at this. It's easy to look back on modern eyes and say he was money driven. It's just what come home to me when I looked at Johnny Giles very kindly showed me his very first Manchester United contract. No. And he was on £12 a week during the season and £8 an off season. It was, and he also had the maximum wage as well. You had instances of Jack Charlton, shooting and skinning rabbits and selling to fellow players. Plus, he was, Terry Venables said, "I always used to like going to Leeds because I always come back with cloth for a new suit for my tailor." So, because he was always, Jack Charlton was selling him the cloth. So I think football, there wasn't money in football. Of course, he was going to look for money. Of course, he was going to be, and also, it's a very insecure profession. He says himself, in his first season, he was sure he'd get sacked. If he'd taken him on third division, he was an untried manager. They would have got rid of him, brought some more experienced in. He said that himself. So there's always a level of insecurity around him. He was never a rich man doing the way he was playing. They'll get to the millions they did today. Yeah. So I think it's easy to, it's very easy and very simplistic to go, yeah, he was very money motivated, but I don't think he was any different to anybody else who was doing on the side. I mean, nobody said about Franny Lee then. Franny Lee making millions of a recycling company. But Franny Lee did the same thing. All he did was secure his family's future. Nobody said about Jack Charlton having sports shops. Yeah, he did. Nobody said about Terry Venables having tailor shops or that wig company he had in the 60s. No, nobody said those things. But because it was because of what happened with, I think, Dubai, it sort of framed him as this Don Revie's character, which I don't think he was doing anything different to anybody else, to be honest. They had to top up their money. They don't have a pension as well during that era as well. So, yeah, from one respect, it is easy to fall into that trap of saying he was money motivated, but I don't think he was any different to anybody else who was playing at that point. Yeah. Or managing that point, I should say. Yeah.
Obviously, the 78 World Cup was the aim, or there was also the 76 Euros at the time. He got off to a relatively decent start as England manager. I mean, as a total, he played or managed 29 games. He won 14, drew 8 and lost 7. But unfortunately, I think the losses were more in the competitive games rather than the friendlies. Although there was a couple of friendlies where they were outclassed. There was the Netherlands friendly. You mentioned as well about when he brought together all the England players in a hotel. Is it a Leicester hotel or somewhere?
Manchester. It was Midland Hotel, Manchester.
That's right. Yeah. Brought loads of them in, introduced himself. And then there was, like you say, Emlyn Hughes. He didn't get on the right side of him straight away, did he?
No, I mean, I think his problem was, and he said this himself later on, he was searching, and he thought, he genuinely naively, looking back now, he thought, I'm going to work with the best players in the country. I can pick whoever I want. And he said he was searching. He was looking for Johnny Giles. He was looking for Billy Bremner. But the fact was, Johnny Giles was Irish. Bremner was Scottish. What he realised quickly was, suddenly, if there's a problem in the centre of the park, I just open my checkbook and I'll buy someone. It's not like that with England manager. And I think the real issue was he didn't have world-class players. Like he said himself later on, he said he used to go before the press and say, I've got world-class players here. And it was a bit lie. He felt we need 2 world-class players he actually had. It was Ray Clemens and Kevin Keegan. There was nobody else he felt that was good enough at that level. And I don't know what the issue was with Hughes, but I would say, especially with Hughes and with Alan Ball as well, he seemed to be such a fantastic manager at Leeds, yet he lost that in England. And there was two issues, really. I think a lot of it was he couldn't settle on his first 11 because he was constantly looking for the Giles and the Brennan that he needed in centre of midfield. The other point was that he really just struggled, I think, with not having day-to-day interaction with the players. And for him, as I said, building this family atmosphere, that was very, very important to him as well. And I mean, he sees the players 2 or 3 days a month or something if he's lucky, So I think those were the struggles as well there. But I think getting back to the Alan Ball situation in particular, I think we get in the book as well. He drops Alan Ball. He has a very good PR stunt against Germany in 75 where he names Alan Ball the captain as a nod and a win to the 1966 World Cup. He's the only survivor of that World Cup squad at that point, Alan Ball. Yet then writes a letter to him and says, I'm no longer going to select you, but thank you for your service. Signed by a secretary, signed in absence of Don Revie, but dictated to by him to a secretary. Now, you don't, whatever you think of Alan Ball, you don't treat people like that, especially somebody who's given service to the country like that. Alan Ball gets upset, his wife Leslie runs the press, and then he gets all this sort of stuff up. All Don Revie wants to play is robots. All he wants is players who say, yes, Mr. Revie, no, Mr. Revie, 3 bags full, Mr. Revie. It hurts Don, but that was the problem for some. And the other issue, I said, there's 3 issues there. The last issue I would say as well, was that he seemed to be, and Ted Croker says in his book as well, he seemed to be very influenced by the press. If there was a press campaign for a particular player, then he would play them. And Malcolm McDonald told me that he said to him, look, come up to you. He said, I've only got you in the side because I've been told to pick you by the press. He said, if you don't score tonight, this is before the Luxembourg game, if you don't score tonight, forget about it ever being selected ever again. Charlie George was another one who just one cap and shouted at him when he was leaving the pitch as well. Stan Bowles, another one who was very late to talk and still played him, even though the disciplinarian Revie at Leeds would not have found that acceptable. Somebody turned up late for this get-together they had in Manchester. So I think there was those 3 issues there that were affected his confidence in the end. I think it started eroding his confidence and also the problems he had behind the scenes with Harold Thompson. I think it eroded his confident facade that he had when he was at Leeds United.
Yeah. I mean, just to go back on a couple of those, maybe to explain a little more, there was the Alan Ball thing, which I wasn't aware of at the time, but reading the book, you can sort of maybe backtrace a little bit to when he was manager of Leeds and he was trying to purchase him from Everton. Yeah. Was it Everton? No. Blackpool. And there was supposedly some underhand payments going to Ball, who then turned down Revie and Leeds and went to Everton. So I wondered if that was maybe something in that one. The Malcolm McDonald one, and as you mentioned, the Luxembourg game, picked on the basis of the press and went and scored all 5 goals, didn't it? And that was pretty much 2 fingers up to his own manager. It's very, very strange. So he tried to bring in that Leeds family ideology that he had. He had all like the dossiers, didn't he? Whilst he was at Leeds, they'd have all these players scouted, and he had that down to a T. Then wanted to try and do it for England, and the players he had weren't interested.
No, they weren't interested. I mean, the other thing he says at his first press conference, I plan to build this team along international lines. He needs involvement. He says, I need to be involved. That's why the under-23s were moved from playing on the same day as the senior side into a different location, different time, so he could watch them as well, and the youth sides as well. But it just wasn't there. I mean, carpet bowls work well. But the thing is, you can understand with these players, Leeds, the Bremners, the Hunters, to go back to that, the Revies, the Spriggs, they were with him from the age of 14. They knew nothing else. All they knew was carpet bowls, bingo, and putting competitions for golf. And Kevin Keegan told me once Stan Bowles, they were doing the putting competition, just slammed the ball and walked out. And that's, it just wasn't there. He couldn't build that family atmosphere. But also, like I said, he was very, involvement is something he talks about an awful lot. I need to be involved with the players. I like being around the boys. I massage them down with my own hands. I need to feel a connection with them, my sons. And then he goes to England, and it's not there. But how can it be there? What's interesting is Alan Clark told me a story. He said once he was injured, he wasn't injured, and he was called up to the England squad. And Don Revie said to Alan Clark, "Tell him you're injured." He said, "I'm not injured." He said, "Tell Alf you're injured." He said, "I'm not injured though." He said, "Look," he said, "who pays your wages?" Yeah. And that was another issue as well. That would have gone round. You know, you'd have had that from the other club managers that he was doing that to Sir Alf. So why would he expect anybody to treat him any different when he was doing the job? You know, if he was telling them who pays your wages, you know. So I think there was a lot of suspicion around it as well.
Yeah. As England manager, he was trying to. Well, I think he was probably banging his head against a brick wall by trying to get the FA on his side by postponing fixtures. So I mean, that's sort of, there were various things that he had at Leeds where he was a bit of a visionary, and this could have been a real vision and should have been done, because I think that probably would have helped him and the England team. But the FA weren't keen on it, were they?
I think his problem was the Football League. He'd fallen out with Alan Hardacre. Honestly, probably held. You know, like I'm saying, Alan Hardacre, he held football back by 30 years. I mean, the introduction of the League Cup specifically because he wanted the League Cup to compete with the FA Cup, which sounds laughable now. You know, this is a guy who says, "Oh, football on television will never take off." You know, you just wonder at this point, if you had somebody like that in head of a commercial organisation talking like that, you'd be out the door the first day. You wouldn't last a week, yeah. No, and I think, you know, Revie said is a great example of how he's banged his head against a brick wall. This guy Alan Hardacre, it was a, you know, for want of a word, total conservative. He's totally conservative. There was nothing to change. Football to kick off the 3 o'clock, so no Sunday games, no television, and the League Cup to replace the FA Cup, so you can increase his empire, shall we say. So 1969, Leeds won the league championships. He goes to the directors. Look, we've got a problem here. He said, you know, we just won the league. He said, you know, the players are going to want more bonuses. They're going to want more money. We're going to have to try and keep them. They've now won the league title. They're the best side in the country. We've got to keep them together. I've got an idea. He said, why don't we get a big firm to write the name across our shirts? He said, that will solve our problems. We get the players' wages in one foul swoop by doing that. Leeds directors go, yeah, that's a brilliant idea, Don. Goes over to Lytham St Anne's. Now, again, all respect, Lytham St Anne's is a nice place, but what is the Football League headquarters doing in a place like Lytham St Anne's, which is more famous for British Open golf? So he goes over there, he speaks to Alan Hardacre. He puts this to Alan Hardacre. Alan Hardacre chucks him out of the office saying, you're going to turn this game into a circus. And he said to him, one day that'll come to pass. So you've got the ultimate innovator. Now, we accept that. We accept companies' names on shirts, even on the shoulders now, you know. Yeah. And he gets that. A true innovator comes up against the conservative and goes, nah, out the door. So when he goes, so they've already fallen out. Hardacre thinks Revies are just somebody on the make. So when he goes to him, Alan, do you think you can cancel games? There's an almighty row in the press. Now, to me, and to you as well, to people listening, it probably does. Why, if you want your England team to be successful, why would potentially want your players to get injured on the Saturday, be ahead of the Wednesday for the big qualifier?
Yeah,
you know, to me, it's common sense. But to Hardacre, not Football League was it. Forget international football as well. And he was it was just Revie was critical. He was also critical of Ramsey as well. You know, so it's just one of those things. I think.
Yeah, the World Cup qualifying draw was, well, not the same as it is now, but basically England were drawn with Italy, Finland and Luxembourg. Italy beat England in Rome. It was the general consensus England were outplayed. Then England lost in a friendly to the Netherlands. And I think that was when sort of maybe the public tide and the media were beginning to maybe turn against Revie. They were never really going to qualify for the 78 World Cup. And that was when the pressure, he felt the pressure then, didn't he? And things were starting to go through his head.
I think though, you know, we talked earlier about fine margins, about losing 7 games, but you know, it's the 7 games you lose. If you lose a friendly against, I don't know, say you lose 7 friendlies against Germany, France and Italy, but then when it comes to the World Cup semi-final, you beat Germany and you're, you know, it doesn't matter. So it's fine margins, and the 2 games that probably turned it all around was years before, was in 1975 ahead of the 76 European Nations Cup, which became the Euros.
Yeah.
They lost to Czechoslovakia and they drew against Portugal, which meant they didn't qualify. Not qualifying for the Nations Cup meant they were seeded then for the World Cup. So there was always a danger they were going to meet one of the European superpowers, which they did with Italy. And now Italy at that point might have had a bit, you know, they were coming out of a transition phase. You know, your people like Capello were still there. But the nucleus of that side was the side that went on to win the World Cup in 1982. You know, so I mean, They took in 6 years. You had Dino Zoff as a keeper, for instance. So I think the problem was that fine margin of error, that not failing the qualifier for the Nations Cup, given them a very tough group game, And I think, as Fred Street said, again, the issue isn't so much the results against the top players. And if you look at the Italian game, they lost 2-0 in Rome. They under Ron Greenwood, they won 2-0 at Wembley, but it was too late. The fact is, against the Finlands and the Luxembourgs, it's, very often the two top sides in a group of four will cancel each other out, which is what happened here. So you've got to run up cricket scores against Finland and Luxembourg. And very often, as Fred Street said, the tougher games are the Luxembourgs, because you've got to win at that point 8, 9, 10-0. Because Italy can do the same thing. So it's all about a race to the top. And actually, what was done for England in that group in that year was the goal difference. They just didn't rep enough goals against the Finlands, and then a terrible game against Finland. They were disappointing against Luxembourg as well. They didn't score as many goals as Italy, and they were out. And so that was in reality, where there's a lot of myth about they got played off the park by the Italians in Rome, and how many teams have been played off the park by the Italians in Rome? But the reality was they didn't do well enough against the Finland and Luxembourg to put pressure on the Italians with goal difference, which would have meant that game against under Ron Greenwood that they'd won that and they'd have a superior goal difference. Of course, they'd been in the World Cup, and we've been talking about what a missed opportunity Revie had rather than what a failure he was.
Yeah, very true. Yeah. There was a point, obviously, where the pressure got to him, and he was approached by the UAE. United Arab Emirates, that, as I say, he didn't take that last game against Italy at Wembley, and you mentioned Ron Greenwood, he took that. But as I mentioned at the very beginning, the UAE, the Dubai, I had no real knowledge about other than just Don Revie and sort of in brackets UAE. I didn't know the whole story about that. So go on, tell us a bit how this sort of came about.
Well, I think this is a point when I came in on the Don Revie story. He seemed to burn brightly, become Leeds manager, the England manager, then go to the UAE, and then disappear off the face of the planet completely. And it's always seemed quite odd to me. This very northern man, very northern Yorkshire man, why he'd go to the UAE? But I think you picked up earlier there, Russell, about the Holland game, and the Holland game, I think, destroyed him in the respect of confidence-wise. I mean, this was a guy who always thought he was deep thinking about the game, the Revie pan, the master tactician, and he really wanted to test himself against the total football of Rinus Michels. And I use Rinus Michels as an example. He's seen Rinus Michels as an example in the book as well, as someone who dominated it with Ajax, was a nowhere club, a bit like Leeds, and they won 3 European Cups in a row. Yeah. And he wanted to really test himself. And that night he came up against the two Johans, Johan Cruyff and Johnny Rep, who ripped them apart. And I think Jeff Power wrote in the Daily Mail, and I quoted the book as well, England joined the also-rans of world football tonight. Even if they qualified for that World Cup, they weren't going to do much because they were so far behind a team like Holland. And at this point, Harold Thompson was agitated, and was apparently Lord Harewood, who was the president of Leeds United and was also cousin of the Queen, informed Revie after the match that Harold Thompson had approached the Cobalt family, who owned Ipswich Town, with a view to appointing Bobby Robson to replace him. Now, Revie obviously got wind of this. Now, at this time as well, Revie wasn't without offers before the UAE. Kim Revie told me Elton John approached him after one of the England games and said, I've got Watford in the 4th division. I want you to come there and do to Watford what you did to Leeds. And Revie said, I can't do it. I'm the England manager. I can't do it. He said, who have you got in mind? He said, I've got Bobby Moore. He said, go for Graham Taylor. He's the best young manager in the league. He's been at Lilleshall. He's one of the best students we've ever had. And the rest is history. Everton approached him as well. I was already approached him in 1973. The Moores family approached him and he said, look, if you wait till November, I'll be in a position to take the job. They didn't want to do that. And they went off on other ones. The UAE comes in. Now he knows Harold Thompson's out to get him. And Harold Thompson allegedly said to Lord Harewood in the Finland game, let's hope it's a good win tonight, Harewood says to Thompson. Thompson goes, yeah, but a good loss and we can be done with it all, which was he wanted to get rid of Revie. Yeah. So Revie knows Thompson, now is chairman of the FA, absolutely hates him. They're agitating to replace him with Bobby Robson. The UAE comes along as well. £350,000 tax-free over a 5-year contract. Revie's thinking, I'm going. And also gets the chance to run football from top to bottom. So he gets exactly what he had at Leeds. But he's at a starting point where he's a supremo. He's going to develop football in schools. He's going to develop youth teams. He's got to develop the national team. This is really right to the street. And also, I think as well, I think Revie may have seen the England job as a semi-retirement job, then a part-time job, going from Leeds, where he's playing 60 games a season, to only having maybe 8 or 9 important games over just a period of 5 years. So he's seen that. So that UAE became the job that he thought England was. That's a retirement job. And also it satisfies the one thing that's in him that we started this conversation about. It satisfies that need for financial security. £350,000 tax-free is going to make me financially secure. And I get to be in the sun, and I get to be in semi-retirement, and I haven't got the pressure of the England job. And he goes over there, and that's the point where he decides to go. They're going to get rid of me anyway. I'm going to jump before I get pushed. Yeah. That's what about me.
It was the way it happened. He sort of made a bit of a rod for his own back in the fact that he got, and we've mentioned Jeff Powell, the Daily Mail journalist. Daily Mail. He got him involved, and they went to Dubai, I think, via Athens, and trying to circumnavigate anyone else. But by getting him involved meant all the other journalists and newspapers and media outlets, they felt sort of aggrieved.
Well, that was, I think Alex Montgomery was the Sun writer who I interviewed, and it was very helpful in the book. He said, Frank Clough, who was his boss at the time of the Sun, was incandescent with rage. He'd introduced Revie to Jeff. You know what I mean? He couldn't believe why Don would do that. And the knives were out for him in Fleet Street at that point. You do not give an exclusive like that to one paper and then run away and make yourself unavailable for interviews as well. So, Daily Mail were controlling the story. And there's a brilliant story in the book where, and Jeff told me this, where they land in Athens and somebody recognised Revie. And so they thought, what's he doing in Athens? Is he going for a job over here? So they ring up a newspaper and say, just seen Don Revie in Athens. It looks like he's leaving the England job. Turns out the paper they rang was the Daily Mail. Jeff said, I could have destroyed the story there and then. But that was the huge problem. And also, I think as well, the story broke before there was a resignation letter reached the FA as well. So the FA were incandescent with rage as well. But I think also, you've got to bear in mind, you don't want Walter Winterbond done Alf Ramsey. I mean, between them, I think they had about 20 odd years, for 30 years, the only two people he knew was England manager were Winterbottom or Ramsey. And suddenly, Revies resigned after 3 years of a job that he says that anybody worth their salt would want. Why has he walked away? And I think he left all these questions behind. But I think then the FA banned him for 10 years from any football activity from 1977 to 1987. There was also a court case where he bristled every time he said he spoke to Harold Thompson. So there was all sorts that went on. But then, I think the judge, Justice Cantley, who actually stood, I don't know if you've seen the programme, A Very English Scandal, about Jeremy Thorpe and Noah Scott, was actually the same judge in the trial, for the following year for Don Revie. And he said he was a prickly man who obsessed about perceived slights. So even his reputation was destroyed in court as well. So the one thing he hoped to do was to clear his reputation. Actually made it even worse for him, I think.
Yeah. One thing I was amazed at, he didn't actually have any full FA coaching badges, did he?
He just had a certificate. Yeah, but he's not. Yeah, but I think you're going to go on now. I don't want to spoil the future podcast, but I think you'll find he's not the only England manager. Glenn Hoddle was another one who didn't have the required coaching badges at the time as well. Oh. I think Ted Croker says in his book as well that he felt by appointing Revie, he made a mockery of the coaching system as well, because a greengrocer was in charge of the schoolboys who never managed as well. Well, if you see what the FA Centre was like during those days, you know what I mean?
It was a surprise, that one. And another thing, I think it was, you mentioned Kim Revie, his daughter, and I think it was in the book that she said when he went to the UAE, as we look at that area now, it's obviously a huge up and coming, or it is a well-established part of the world now. But looking back on it, he was one of maybe the early instigators of that area becoming what it is now, by having such a high-profile person go there.
It was the desert. There was nothing there. It's not like it is now. I've never been to the UAE, but there's skyscrapers there. There's all sorts of leisure complexes. But you got the Dubai Grand Prix there now. But he said though in 1978 interview, he said, this place is mushrooming. It's going to be huge in 10 years' time. You know what I mean? And it was. The money they poured into Dubai, but when he went there, it was literally the desert years. Perhaps I should use that as the title of the chapter for that.
So, I mean, he spent 7 years out there in various positions. I get the impression he enjoyed it, but it didn't really go his way. I mean, as a team, the UAE were never really going to be huge. But then sort of after that time, he returned back to England, said that he wasn't ever going to get involved in football again. And I think he had a few offers, but was true to his word and ended up in Scotland, which was where his wife Elsie came from.
Yeah. He came across QPR when Alan Hudson was sacked. Jim Gregory was very, very keen on taking him in 1984 to manage QPR. Got very, very close. And I don't know, judging what I've read about Jim Gregory, I don't know if it was a PR stunt that he was going to bring Don Revie back to English football. Don was very keen on going there, actually.
All right.
And apparently the negotiations ended because Don Revie changed the terms of the money he wanted. He said it was a slight different way he wanted to be paid, but again, Gregory ran to the press and said, "Oh, it's Don being greedy again," And Don was quite annoyed about it. He said, he rang him up and said he met him to travel to Loftus Road to meet him. They met in a hotel nearby. So Don was expecting to come back at QPR in 1984. He said himself he's 30 years of experience at that point, or 40 years of experience at that point. He thinks he can pass something over. And even ITN were running as a story, and Thames Television. So there's archive footage that was very serious about that. But he was also touted for the Man City job when Man City were having problems. Quoted once for the Arsenal job as well. And also interestingly, as late as when Eddie Gray left the Leeds job, he was quoted in the Mirror as the plan was that Revie becomes a supremo and Johnny Johns becomes the manager. But then obviously Revie said, "No, I'm never going back to Leeds. I can't repeat what I've done there," and things like that. Yeah, but in the main, apart from those little, QPR's biggest story, but those little sort of his name's being connected, you have very little to do with football. You say for coaching Yorkshire Television football schools as well, and he retired to Scotland in 1986 with his wife back in Kinross.
And he played golf a lot there, but unfortunately,
also he won the Players' Championship twice in the 50s. Would you believe? They used to have a Players' Championship every year, and he won it back to back when he was at Man City. Yeah,
what for golf?
Golf, yeah. Every summer they used to have a Players' tournament. There's a lovely story. Kevin gives us an aside, really. Kevin Keegan tells. He says so they went to see Shankly. They were Liverpool with Kevin Keegan, and at that point all the teams had golf teams, and they needed push from the manager. And Kevin Keegan and Emily said. He said, so Kevin was that squeaky. He goes, "Hey, can we have a Liverpool golf side, boss? Can we? And Kevin came back, I think we should do. I really enjoy golf." And Shankly doesn't look up to him and says, "They got a golf team, eh?" He said, "Yes, they have." He said, "Well, they keep playing golf and we'll keep winning championships. Out you go, boys." I love that. So golf is always huge at football. I love that. Yeah, played a lot of golf. I think he was a 6 handicap. But actually, interestingly, he had a place in Marbella, and Kevin Keegan was one of his golfing partners. Actually, so they were very close. Yeah, when Keegan retired from Newcastle. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I know Keegan said some nice words at his funeral, which I guess is where we are sort of now. He was up in Kinross in Scotland, and then unfortunately sort of was diagnosed with motor neurone disease, and then at the age of 61, I believe, passed away, which I mean is no age at all, considering what his life had been like previously. It all happened quite suddenly, really, didn't it?
Yeah, I think motor neuron disease is a cruel, wicked disease, and in my other life, in my political life, I've done a lot of work with Motor Neuron Disease Association. I ran the London Marathon 1 year as well. But it is, there's nothing wrong with your brain, and your body is just shutting down. And most people who are diagnosed with it die within 18 months. It's quite simply because it's got the symptoms of so many other things. They've got to rule so many other things out to actually diagnose motor neuron disease. You're really at the end of the cycle of that disease once you are diagnosed. And of course, I think the bravest thing for all Don Revie was, or perceived to be, I think ultimately he was an extremely brave man. And I think the most moving part, the toughest parts of that book was that chapter on motor neuron disease. I've met so many brave people within the Motor Neuron Disease Association. And I think if you watch the footage of the testimonial game in 1988 against Leeds United, Don Revie Select 11, where Paul Gascoigne played and scored, John Robertson was there, Graham Souness, Kevin Keegan was there, Peter Shilton, and he comes out in a wheelchair. And it must have taken so much bravery for a man who everybody remembered as the Don, the Godfather, the second father, the man who dominates Ellen Road, comes out, he's reduced to a wheelchair. And he leaves after 20 odd minutes. And he says the last thing he ever said was, I thought the tears would come, but they didn't. I held them back. And I'd like to thank all the people for coming out and doing such a great job, and Billy and the boys for doing such a great job for me. I need to leave early. And just to see that footage and see the bravery and dignity in the man as well. There's a lot of dignity in the man in that footage as well. Even after all these years later, and I never knew him, and that's the real regret I got, is I never got to meet the guy. Yeah. And I did have a lot of admiration for him. And it was that point, I think, when I really did feel change from fascination into admiration, because I think the battle he waged was brave and powerful, and I think he did more to raise awareness for motor neuron disease than anybody else. And don't forget, again, I don't want to go on about the press, but there's a really nasty story in the News of the World where they said he got one of the sheikhs he worked for in Dubai had paid for a miracle treatment in the Soviet Union at that time, which meant he was walking again and was cured. And it was such a cruel article, not just for the Revie family, but for all the sufferers of motor neuron disease as well, because there's no cure, and I still don't know what causes it. And I think there's still a lot of work to do. But I think Don, his lasting legacy really is whenever you mention motor neuron disease, he's always mentioned about David Niven and Don Revie both had the disease. And I think that is the only good thing to come out of that, really. There we are. Yeah.
Well, let's see, he passed away 26th of May, 1989, which, as an Arsenal supporter myself, that day resonates with me. And because it was the Arsenal-Liverpool title at Anfield on the last day of the season. And you mentioned at the beginning, there was no mention of him that day. The Arsenal players came out with flowers. They were wearing black armbands, but that was more in relation to the Hillsborough disaster, which had happened the April before. So that's surprised me a lot there. But at his funeral, and we mentioned Kevin Keegan, who was one of the players that puts Revie quite highly. He said that it saddens me that a public at large had and still have the wrong impression of him. He was kind, generous and caring. When he left the England job, he did the right thing for his family, but did it wrongly. He knew it was big enough to admit it. He'd have been as successful as Alf Ramsey with England if the players had been good enough, but we weren't. So I think it shows probably, dare I say, everything there in a nutshell by Keegan.
Yeah, I also think as well, and I think, my view at the end, the epilogue is my personal view of Don Revie, but, what I would say at the end of the day, I grew up in the 90s, I came of age in the 90s, and I was a teenage, late teens, early 20s, I'm wearing today my Main Road 25th anniversary Oasis, Broad jumper just for you. This is the 3 Lines podcast, okay? Yeah, but, that Oasis period was so linked up to football. I mean, I was coming from the pub on a Friday night. It was always fancy football. You had people like Jeff Astle on there. Do you remember singing? Yeah. And you had Phoenix from the Flames, where they'd reenact all the great. They even reacted the famous game with West Brom, where Astle scored miles offside, and Revie ran on the pitch with a picnic blanket in his arm. Bizarre.
I had to YouTube that when I read it. Yeah. I was like, what's this about?
It's bizarre. It looks really bizarre. And he's like looking at the sky. Yeah, but again, if you notice the superstition, he looks up at the sky like, you've done it to me again. That's what I always think he's almost saying to who's ever up there. You know what I mean? But what I would say is what he didn't have was that chance to redeem himself. And you think about, when I was a young kid watching football, I remember George Bestman on Terry Wogan be absolutely smashed, drunk, right. Embarrassingly drunk, an alcoholic, and I got all that sympathy for that. But as a young man, doesn't understand these things. I couldn't understand why everybody was falling over him because he just seemed me drunk all the time. He was always in the paper drunk. By 1996, and it's the 60s, it's nostalgia, and it's looking back. If Oasis are the new Stones and the Beatles, and the Blur and Oasis are Stones versus the Beatles, then suddenly Manchester United at best, low on Charlton, best suddenly is on the alcoholic anymore. Best's a young man again, and he's always on the television, and Rodney Marsh and all these type of people. And these people you're seeing for a long, long time, finally it's starting to have a say. They're starting to reappraise football as well, because for a long time football was hated, especially in the Thatcher years. It was hated. Suddenly it becomes cool again, and the history becomes cool. And it's interestingly, in the midst of that, Billy Bremner dies. Captain of Leeds, the massive heart now, dies. So the leader can't redeem himself. The manager is gone. He can't redeem himself. And what happens is Revie is not, I think, by that point, by the 90s or 96, if we look at the 96 Euros, at that point, Revie would have been 68. He would have been a pundit. He would have been one of the pundits in Euro 96. Definitely. Yeah. Jimmy Hill and Terry Venables was doing, he would have been the pundit. He'd have been able to redeem himself there. And, we'd have had Des Lino saying, well, you come up with a Revie plan. You came up with the false number 9, Don. What was this all about? You've had that. You've had a voice. And I think the tragedy of him, there was a chance for redemption in the 90s, but he wasn't around to receive that. And I think the real problem for Revie as well is it's not just for those who don't know the Revie story or the allegations, it's also that period where he comes to prominence. I think of that early century, industrial unrest, general malaise in society, punk saying we've got no future. And he's all part of that. It's not somewhere you feel all warm and fuzzy about. It's not, Love Me Do, or She Loves You, or Penny Lane, or Strawberry Fields, or the Rolling Stones, or the Carnaby Street. It's that. It's not. There's violence on the pitch. There's hooliganism on the terraces. It's not. Warm and fuzzy about it. And I think that's the real tragedy of Revie. He never really was allowed to his point of view of other people were. So that's really the sad thing about Revie.
Yeah.
But I want to end on a high, so ask me something positive about it.
Well, I was going to say he is remembered fondly in statue form. He's outside Elland Road. I've stood beside that, and he'll forever be known at Leeds. Even I think, as you write at the end of the book, doesn't matter whether Leeds, when they won the championship with Harold Wilkinson, or under David O'Leary and Peter Risdale when they got to the Champions League semi-finals. Leeds' glory years will always be under Don Revie. Yeah,
and I feel whenever I go to Allen Road, I feel like it's a shrine to him, and rightfully so. He built the club. The statue casts a shadow of every visit on the day. And what was interesting, I listened to when they were in the playoff semi-final a couple of years ago, they lost to Derby. I listened to the radio. I was driving around London. I was listening on the radio. And you could hear them going, there's only one Don Revie, there's only one Don Revie. When I went up there, they were singing, there's only one Don Revie, and marching on together. Yep. And the lead Don Revie stand, the white shirts. And Don is everywhere there. And I think, it must be wonderful for the family that they want to remember him or want to feel he's still alive. You just need to go there. And so many of us lose relatives, we lose family. But there, he is still there. The spirit of Don Revie lives on, and it must be wonderful for the family. I would imagine, But again, within the players as well, and there's an interesting. It's not in the book, but there's that interesting tribute to Sir Matt Busby with Blackburn play Leeds at Ewood Park. They start chanting, "There's only one Don Revie." 5 years after he died, the Leeds fans still remember Don Revie, and they always will. And I think he is Mr. Leeds. End of. And I think Keegan was right. Had, Revie had Bobby Moore and Jack Charlton and Bobby Charlton and Jimmy Greaves, he would be the England manager you'd probably be talking about won the World Cup. But he didn't have the players. That's the truth. I think he's absolutely right. And Kevin Keegan probably was, and Ray Clems were probably the only world-class players he had. Shilton probably as well, but he didn't really fancy Shilton. But, those, he didn't have the players.
Yeah. It's
difficult to think who jumps out at you of that team. It's only Keegan, really. There's nobody else there, so that's where we are. Yeah.
Well, it is a great book. It's Don Revie, the biography by yourself, Chris Evans. It's through Bloomsbury Books. It's not the only book you've written, though, is it?
No, it's not. No, it's the second book I've written. So the first one was about Freddie Mills, the boxer. I don't know if you know anything about Freddie Mills, but Freddie Mills was light heavyweight champion from 1948 to 1950. Became a entrepreneur in the 50s and a big TV star, and was actually the forerunner to Kevin Keegan, George Best, Henry Cooper, David Beckham, as just a superstar who overturned that, stepped over that magical line between sporting fame and worldwide fame. And he presented 6-5 Special, which was a forerunner, Top of the Pops, loads of variety shows. started the very first Chinese restaurant in Soho in London.
Really?
Because the food when he was in the war and decided to import it into this country. So that's the reason we've got Chinese takeaways on every corner in town. Then started a nightclub and got involved with a pair of brothers known as Ronnie and Reggie Cray. And mysteriously was found dead in the back of his car in Goslet Yard with a gunshot wound to his eye. And nobody knows what happened to Freddie Mills. But I'm not going to tell you. You have to read the book, buy the book.
well, what's the next book then? Who have you got your eye on?
I don't know. I really don't know at the moment. I mean, it was a real labor. Don, I guess it was a labor of love. You know, I miss him. I should say I was on my wife. I miss him. I feel she said he's net. That sounds nuts, but I do. I feel like I lived 2.5 years took me to write the book, and I feel like I lived with him for 2.5 years. And there's a bit of sadness when the book was released. Like, I've got to give him away now. You know, I can't spend any more time with you now, Don. And it's sad. But I enjoyed every single minute. The very first visit was a visit to Middlesbrough, where it all started for him. And I think the last visit was Ellen Road. It was Wembley was the last visit I did, actually. But it ended for him, football-y, shall we say. And I just loved every single minute of it. And I hope whoever I do next that I have that same sort of effect. And in the end, so when you spend that much time with someone, you've got a lot of affection for him. And I do feel very, very protective of him. So when people have a go at him, I want to jump up and shout, no, it's not like that. You know, he was one. To me, you know, and I've got to say this, you know, he was the greatest manager of all time. I'm sorry, Bertie Mee, and I'm sorry, George Graham and Arsene Wenger and Alex Ferguson. But the reason why I say he was the greatest of all time is this. When he came to Leeds, they'd only ever won the second division in the 1930s. They had no pedigree whatsoever. They had no fans. They were obsessed by cricket and rugby league. He turned that around. He built that side from absolutely nothing. And look what he did to them. You know, he didn't just take them and win. It wasn't like Leicester winning the odd title of the year. That was dominance what he was doing. You know, and in terms of innovation, you know, you can talk about your Fergusons, your Paisleys, your Shankleys, you know, even your Cloughs. The fact is, all the teams they turned around and turned into winners would already been winners at one point. Derby won the FA Cup in the 40s under Raish Carter. Nottingham Forest had won things. We all know about Manchester United, Liverpool, sleeping giants. We all know about, all right, you know, they go through what I say lulls, like Manchester United goes through a lull at the moment, but you know they'll come back eventually. Arsenal are going through a lull. They were before Wenger came there, you know. When 91 to 96 was a lull for them then, but then Wenger came along and it turned it around. These clubs, those bigger clubs do have lulls, but with Leeds, they were flatlining and he breathed life into them, and that's why I say he was the greatest manager. And the sadness about him all, I think, really is, you know, for 13 years of super success at Leeds, all we ever talk about is 3 years at England. And I'm glad you're doing the England podcast. So I just want to say one thing I said off camera to you was, it is the worst job in the world. I don't think there's anybody who's walked away with their reputation in tatters. So, and I think wider, I think that's why top managers don't want the job anymore. You know, it's because of what you have to go through. And I'd be interested now when you do Ron Greenwood and do Bobby Robson, particularly Bobby Robson, I'm looking forward to, because I think what started with Revie probably got to a zenith with Robson in terms of the way the tabloid press were treating him. So I'd be really interested. I'd be really interested when you do the Robson one. That's what I'm really looking forward to, because I think he had more abuse than anybody in that job. You know, and I think I've spoken to a lot of sports journalists who said that if they were stuck for a story, all they'd ever do is so-and-so said Bobby Robson's crap, needs to be out of the job. So that's when, yeah. So I think the things that started minutely with Ramsey got worse under Revie, then got terrible under Robson, this media interest in the job and their personal life. So that's, you know, that's anyway.
Well,
but thank you for having me on today. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. That could have chatted for hours on end, which probably bored some of your listeners out there. But I hope this Welshman's done that Englishman Don Revie a good job anyway. So that's good.
Absolutely. No, thank you very much. You're on Twitter, I believe. You're at Chris_Evans MP, if people want to give you a follow there. I should also say thank you to Catherine McPherson at Bloomsbury Sportsbook for her help on this. It is the Don Revie biography book. It's ideal time, Christmas coming up, great book. And yeah, I just want to say thank you very much for your time, Chris.
Thank you very much. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thanks once again to Chris Evans there for his time chatting to me about Don Revie. From both the chat and the book, I've learnt a lot more about the man, and perhaps my perspective of him has changed. It is a great read, and it's available from Bloomsbury Books and any good bookshop. As I also mentioned, the previous episodes where we've concentrated on the two previous England managers, Sir Walter Winterbottom and Sir Alf Ramsey, are available at threelionspodcast.com or your podcast provider of choice. And with Revie in the bag, we now move on to Ron Greenwood. That episode, you'll be pleased to know, will be coming your way very soon. And I hope you can join me for that, and indeed, many more England-based episodes. So until then, take care of yourself. Cheers.